I would like to introduce Galen Broaddus, who is a writer, a former English teacher, a web developer, and an occasional secular activist who lives in central Illinois with his son, 2 sons, and his wife. He is now a certified secular celebrant with the Center for Inquiry. But let me sort of provide this as a way for you to understand who he is. Prior to January 4th, 2017, secular celebrants were unable to solemnize marriages in Illinois. But due to a federal court decision in Center for Inquiry and Galen Broaddus versus Bean, the statute that excluded secular humanists was ruled unconstitutional. Broaddus will talk about why this lawsuit was necessary and why some atheists wish he never took on this battle at all. Please welcome Galen Broaddus.
Good morning. I want to thank you all, first of all, for inviting me to come up here. I do a lot of speaking as a celebrant, but I don't necessarily do a lot of speaking about my celebrant work. So anytime I get a chance to come and talk about that, whether or not it's the work that I'm actually actively doing now as a celebrant, or the work that I had to do in order to get to do the work that I'm doing right now, I always am pleased to take that opportunity. So thank you again for the invitation for that. Again, my name is Galen Broaddus. I live in Decatur, which is further downstate. I am actually a lifelong resident of Illinois, but the not Chicago part of that. I think it's you folks would know it as Southern Illinois, south of 80. Downstate, yeah, downstate. Trust me, there's a very interesting kind of tension whenever I talk to people about Chicago in downstate, and but trust me, I know I'm not in hostile territory at the moment. Just to give you an idea of my background, I actually am from an evangelical Christian family, and in a lot of ways that informed a lot of what I'm doing in some kind of interesting ways. And the main way is that I actually was born into a family where ministry was very important. My father, for most of my childhood, was a Baptist minister, mostly Southern, but he didn't necessarily discriminate as long as you were a Baptist of some kind. And so a lot of my childhood was based around that. I did a lot of things that were based around the life of the church, and I got to know community in that context. And I will say that did seem to be a kind of interesting jumping off point for me. Before I ever got around to anything that was both outside the life of the church and dealing with any kind of celebrant work, music was actually kind of my gateway into this. I've been doing music in some form for most of my life. I've been playing piano since I was about 4, doing all kinds of different things. And what that kind of led me into was seeing how different people functioned to facilitate the life of a community. And there's a sense in which I always thought, even now, there's still a way in which I kind of think back to some of those moments. For instance, in the life of a Baptist church, baptisms are a huge thing. And if any of you are involved with well, even to be honest, any of the Christian groups who use child baptism or things like that, that's a really big part of saying this person is a part of our community. We want to recognize that they are a part of our community now. I think it kind of went to sleep on me. I don't know exactly what the deal is.
Something's happened to our connection here.
Yeah. There we go. All right. Technology is fun. And one of the ways that actually became important to me is that I actually, because I was a pianist, and because that was one of the main things that a church needs. You need people to speak. You need people to be there to help bring those moments there. I actually got to see weddings and funerals from that perspective first. But I got to see how important those rituals were in the life of the church, and in the life of individuals. And that was really important. It was a way for me to think about how religion, in this case, but any community in general, could have rituals as a way of coming around some kind of shared meaning. That is essentially what rituals are about. They're about sharing some meaning between a group of people. And in sharing with that, that can be something that makes an event, that makes something more meaningful to you. And what happened to me is eventually I kind of pulled outside the orbit of religion, as I sometimes refer to that. I achieved escape velocity, and I found myself on the outside. And this would have been about, actually, not quite 7 years ago. And one of the questions that I kind of had to grapple with was, what now? Where do these things become important? Is it still something that is useful outside of religion? And my impulse was to say yes, that you don't become less in need of these moments, less in need of these shared acts of meaning with other people. Even if they're people who you don't share a lot of beliefs with, you may share the same kinds of values. There are things that are meaningful between you. And I came back in a lot of ways to marriage and to memorials as the ways that actually does provide common meaning. And so when this happened, there was a process of me trying to figure out, okay, well, I'd like to be a part of this. I don't have necessarily communities where I'm part of this, so how do I actually do that? And that's where I kind of fell. So just to give you a little bit of background on me, I am, again, a certified secular celebrant with the Center for Inquiry, or the Center for Inquiry, depending on who you ask. Trust me, it's a point of contention. Nobody pronounces it the same way. And I will refer to them for that reason, in part, as just CFI for the rest of this talk. I actually have been a writer. I used to blog at the Pathos Network. My blog was called Across Rivers Wide. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I've written on there because I was blogging through the whole process of the fight that I was having with the secular celebrant issue here in the state. So there's a lot of it there, even though I'm no longer actively there. And again, as mentioned, I was one of the plaintiffs in what I try to just call Center for Inquiry v. Bean, because throwing my name in there seems a little both self-aggrandizing and also a mouthful. And we filed that in 2016, although it resolved early in 2017. We did file this in the Central District of Illinois, in District Court. And there's the statute. I always just like to throw that in because we did have a specific statute that has to do with solemnizing marriages, and I will come back to that detail in just a second in case there's anyone who's confused about what that term means. Before I do that, I do want to kind of just point out one thing here. The reason that this is an issue is in part because, again, as you have people leaving these circles where they have this sense of shared community. If you're a part of a religious community, you know how that fits for you. And you know what those kinds of things are in that context. Again, I knew as a Baptist, baptism was a part of that. So were marriages and funerals and other things like that. Those were things that we knew were a part of the life of the community. When you step outside that, even if you have secular communities to fall into, you still have that need for that. So what happens as religious people become non-religious, or as people are raised in a non-religious manner? As that section of a population becomes less religious, what happens to those people? And this is not just a U.S. issue. Just to give you a couple of things, I will tell you I have tried to research the marriage issue across a lot of different things, and it gets a little complicated country to country, but just to give you, and actually it gets complicated state by state when we're talking about the U.S. Just to kind of give you an idea for that, looking at a couple of other Anglophone countries that we have information on. So the British Humanist Association has been working for a number of years to actually allow humanist weddings in the UK, in the 3 countries that I believe at this point still don't recognize humanist weddings, which is every country within the UK except Scotland. They've been on the increase despite that, and despite the fact that weddings in general have seen a decrease. So the proportion of humanist weddings has continued to go up. I think this is about 2012 to 2016 that this figure is from. And in Scotland, they are recognized, and humanist weddings are greater in number than the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland. And that is nothing to scoff at. Those are institutions that have had a pretty good stronghold within those. And the fact that they've been on the rise shows that there is a need for those things. People have a desire for them. A similar kind of thing happened in Australia. They essentially what happened there is I believe in 1973, they instituted civil marriage celebrants as a way to say if you didn't want to get married by a religious officiant or just your typical civil marriage authority, which would be in here like going to the county clerk or something like that, you had this other option. And essentially what happened is that everybody was like, that's a great idea, let's do that instead. And so they've now surpassed those in 99, and by 2011 they were 70% of marriages. Again, shows that there's a great need for that. Here in the U.S., we still obviously have a very religious society, but it is becoming less so. I don't even know that I need to necessarily give you a lot of the statistics on that, because you probably read a lot about the rise of the nuns. You've heard about people, and they may not all be atheists, they may not be agnostics, they may not be secular humanists. They may just be people who don't care about religion at all. They don't want anything to do with it, whether or not that is some kind of trauma with that, or a distaste for it, or seeing the organizations themselves as bad actors. There are people who just don't want that in their life anymore. And so when it comes to these moments, they still have that need, and so they're still trying to find something for that. And I will tell you that from the weddings in particular that I've done, I see a wide range of people. I'll come back to that maybe a little bit. But there are a lot of different types of people who seek out secular ceremonies of some kind. And if there's a need, then there's a place for that need to be filled by individuals. But who does that? And how does that actually happen? So I'll come back to that point of solemnization. So we talk about weddings in particular, and a lot of this will be kind of wedding focused, although I hope to come back to the issue of memorials because that is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. We tend to talk about this in terms of we have officiating the ceremony and then we have the solemnizing. And what we're talking about here is the legal right to have that union recognized. Now, obviously, there are things that states require of the couple for that union to be recognized. For instance, lots of states before the Obergefell decision didn't recognize same-sex unions, and that was one of those things. There's all kinds of other ones to deal with relation to each other and all those kinds of things. But to actually have somebody to do that, you have to have somebody who's willing to who has the authorization by the state to then take that once the ceremony is done and actually return that to the authority that registers that. And again, here in Illinois, that tends to be county clerks. And then they have the stamp of this union is officially recognized by the state. So that's what solemnization essentially is. There's no requirement for us to have done anything particular for a ceremony. I have never been told you have to use this exact language for that. It's basically, did you go through some steps to say this couple has officially done the thing that they set out to do when they got a marriage license from the county? That's it. That's really all it comes down to, is do you have the right to do this one last step? And that may seem like a very small thing, but I will tell you, as someone who was unable to do this for 2 years or so, it actually is very consequential. It's the difference between being able to help somebody fully and being able to say, I can only go part way to getting to you to where you want to be. And that makes a big difference. And I will tell you that I had a lot of people who, when they heard that, went, I think I'll find somebody else. And that's a little bit hard because you want to help people do that. And being able to do that now has been an incredibly fulfilling part of that. It's also nice just to be able to say to a couple, this is not a thing you have to worry about. I'll take care of it all for you. And you handle it all. And it's easier for them in the process too. So here's how it kind of works. In most states, there are certain officiants that kind of across the board have the right. Honestly, there really are 51 different sets of marriage laws in the country. It's really as diverse as the places where you can get married. And even among states, it can be a little bit interesting because you have different processes for the rest of New York State, and New York City has certain things they want you to do. There are different things you can have like that. So it gets very complicated. And I will tell you right offhand, I will give you kind of a snapshot of how this works. And it is very much a approximation of how it works, because trying to find all this information is tricky. And there's conflicting information out there. So keep that in mind with this. So typically, if I had to just boil it down, judges, and sometimes that includes former judges, sometimes it includes lawyers who get appointed a judge for a weekend. There are usually some kind of civil servants. In some places in the country, not in Illinois in this case, you have like justice of the peace. Some states have notaries public that actually can do this function. And then in some way, usually there's religious or sometimes tribal officials who can do that. And again, even that is different. For instance, if you go to North Carolina and you are a Universal Life Church ordained minister, sorry, not going to be recognized. And there's just weirdness about that and how these laws are written that, truthfully, if they were challenged, probably wouldn't hold up. But that's kind of how it works for now. So, and there is also the process in some states where you can self-solemnize, or what's called the self-uniting union, where basically the couples just say, hey, we agree that we did this thing. They sign it. That's it. And it doesn't matter who the officiant is or what their status is. The couple can do it, and it's fine. So there's 4 states that do that. As I mentioned, notaries public can do it in some states. And there's even a couple of states that have weird options where it's just like, if you want to do this for a day, you can get deputized in some places in California. Massachusetts has like a 1-day designation. There's a similar thing in Alaska, I believe. That's where it gets really weird. And so it would be nice if there was some uniformity, but I don't see that probably happening anytime soon because states like to have control over that stuff, since they're the ones who ultimately are responsible for it, even if, in some cases, the government has to step in and say, nope, that's actually not valid, like we had in Loving versus Virginia with interracial marriage, like we had in Obergefell with same-sex marriage. You get these things occasionally. So here's kind of what it looks like. And just to give you kind of an idea, those 4 states in green that you see there, which is Indiana, and Illinois, Oregon, and then very tiny DC, those are the places where secular celebrants who are completely unaffiliated, like everybody across the board can do that. So if I wanted to go to DC and do a wedding, I would be able to. I would not have to have any other kind of status to do so. Those 4 states in blue are the ones where you can self-solemnize. The ones in orange are the ones where you can get like a temporary designation. And then the ones in yellow are the ones where the notary is public. That massive red section is all the rest of the country, where if I wanted to go to Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, and do a wedding, sorry, I can't do the next function of that. I'm just entirely locked out of doing that. And again, until 2017, that also included Illinois. So that's where we stand. There's a lot of work to be done. I will also note one quick thing in case anybody's wondering what the 2 states are that have lines through them. That would be Tennessee, or rather Texas and Michigan. Those are states where we're trying to do the same thing. And I will come back to those fights here in a little bit. So here's where it kind of all starts. Just to give you a little background, and I'll try and kind of move through this so we can get to the meat and bones of the rest of this. In Indiana, in 2014, we kind of started this whole process. And the way this actually happened is Reba Boyd-Wooten, who's currently the executive director of CFI Indiana, and she's also the head of CFI's Secular Celebrant program now. She trains celebrants. She actually became a part of CFI because their local chapter became a branch of CFI. She had been affiliated with the Humanist Society previously to that, and she had done weddings very frequently. And suddenly, as a part of CFI, being part of CFI, she had lost her affiliation with the Humanist Society. And subsequently, she lost her right to actually solemnize marriages in Indiana, because Indiana had a law that's very similar to what Illinois was. And actually, it still is, to be perfectly fair. So in June 2012, actually, CFI, and it was Reba, and then there was actually a couple who was involved who were unable to do so. Because the legal process takes a while, they ended up getting their marriage solemnized another way so they could just have a legal marriage and didn't have to be in limbo. But CFI and Reba were still able to continue with that. And what they essentially did is they sought an injunction so that Indiana wouldn't be able to enforce that statute that kept her from being able to solemnize marriages. And here's the 2 grounds that we talk about this from legal terms. First of all, saying that this right, that these statutes violate the First Amendment by privileging religion over non-religion in some way. If you say religious officiants can do this thing, but non-religious officiants can't, who functionally serve the same role in people's lives, you are privileging religion over non-religion in some way. And in fact, actually, the way that this came down is to find that Indiana also kind of was discriminating between religions too. Go figure. But that's the first part. The second part is that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because people weren't necessarily, in all cases, able to find people who would actually be able to fulfill this function in their lives, who shared a value and didn't have to say, yes, I am religious to do this. Who could say, very honestly, I'm not religious in any way. I'm not affiliated with that, even to the point of just a legal technicality, as it happens for, to be honest, a lot of different functionally secular groups who have the right, like the Humanist Society or the American Ethical Union for the ethical societies. Those groups are all basically secular, but have some connection to religion in some way, and so they get that status. CFI said you shouldn't have to do that. No one should need to do that to get to do the same thing, because what the Humanist Society and what CFI are doing in their celebrants it's the same thing. We're fulfilling the same role in non-religious people's lives. That's all we're doing. And so those two arguments essentially are, anytime we've talked about this, that's what it kind of boils down to. And they lost in district court. And so this is where the legal part of this gets kind of interesting. And I don't know if any of you are sort of legal watchers like I am, but knowing the mechanics of this actually is kind of important. So I'll try and be brief about this. This is what district courts, this is what appellate courts look like in the U.S. They are geographical. So, and in fact, the Obergefell decision, what kind of happened is you had a whole bunch of different decisions that happened in appeals courts. And mostly they were in favor of allowing same-sex unions, of overturning the bans that happened in those states, until you got to the Sixth Circuit. And that's where you had Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee, that the court over those said, nope, we're going to uphold those bans. And that's where the Supreme Court said, all right, I guess we have to step in and do something. And that's where we got the Obergefell decision that actually happened. Obergefell, I think it was like 4 cases joined, 1 in each state, but I think they were like the couple from Ohio. And so that's what actually got us to that point. So it's important to remember that within each appeals court, that decision is binding. It's not binding outside of that. And when you have different decisions, that's where, again, it becomes more of a live issue for the Supreme Court to try and take up. So this all happened in the Seventh Circuit, because Indiana is there. I would also note the other 2 states that fall within that, which happen to be Wisconsin and Illinois. So we won that first battle. And in July 2014, a 3-judge panel, Judge Frank Easterbrook is the one who wrote that decision, and it's like I said, it's a very interesting decision. He talks about, for instance, where the state basically concludes that the Church of Satan could be able to do this, but not someone who just didn't want to say they were religious, like just calling out the hypocrisy of that, and the fact that the state said, yeah, that's right, that's basically what we're saying. We think that's a good thing, that this organization can do it, but this can't. Yeah, that didn't hold up. And so they overturned that district court decision, and here's kind of the other key part to that. Indiana had decided, we don't want to waste any more money on this trying to appeal it to the Supreme Court, because they didn't know if the Supreme Court would take it up. So that decision has remained intact ever since. And this is kind of the key thing, because it covers that, the precedent does apply in all of the states that are covered by the Seventh Circuit. But you have to actually do something to challenge it. It doesn't just become like the Seventh Circuit says this is good, and so it's a rubber stamp, and all the other things within there are done. No, it has to be challenged. So here's where I come in. And it was actually really good timing, because at this time in 2014, I was affiliated with a group that was connected to CFI, not one of the branches, but an affiliated group with the Council for Secular Humanism, which is a part of CFI. And at that point, we had a member who had gone to, I believe, the Women in Secularism conference that year in DC, and they had a training there. Reba was actually there, and so that was one of the workshops they had, was to do that training. And she came back and said, we should do this. We should get more people going. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I'd been looking to do this for like 3 years at that point. And I'm just waiting for the opportunity for that to come up. And so I jumped on it, and I went in October of that year. and to Indianapolis to do that training, a day-long training. And one of the things that Reba talked about was the fact that we had gotten this decision and that it covered Illinois, and that we were looking to challenge some of these other laws in other states. And one thing you should know about me is that when I get interested in something, I kind of throw myself in head first. And so literally, I left Indianapolis that Saturday, came back home, and I think probably Sunday, I immediately was contacting Nick Little, who is CFI's legal director, and I was basically like, okay, I'm in. And I knew that there was, that what this kind of came down to was we might have a legal fight, and I would have to put my name to a lawsuit. And it was a little bit daunting, but I just said, it's worth it. I want to do this thing. It's going to be a thing that actually helps other people. I want to go for it. So we didn't actually start with the legal part. This is where this is going to be kind of skipping around a little bit, because a lot of really boring stuff kind of happened here, because legal fights are sort of flash in the pan. You get a lot of things that are happening. You get your decisions. You get all those kinds of things. Those points. Lobbying is very much a grind, and I will tell you, having never done lobbying before this, I want to emphasize that I was a complete novice when I stepped into this process. It is a very interesting thing to try and do. If none of you have ever done this, I really highly encourage you, find an issue that you want to get in there, get involved with an organization that's leading that fight, and go for it. Because it's hard. It is a little bit stressful, but it is a very rewarding thing to actually try and do that. So if you've never done that, I really encourage you that. I've actually sometimes given this talk on activism to say, like, hey, I didn't know anything before I stepped into this, and I got this done. You can do this too. So before we even get there, we have to think about a legislative change. And there's two main reasons for that. You may think, oh, you got a decision. Just go ahead and sue them, and then you can get to that point. We could have done this in like 6 months or 9 months just by going straight for the lawsuit. And instead, it took us like 2 years to get there. Like, why didn't we just go for it? Well, there's kind of two reasons for that. One is that it's just more impressive to get legislation passed. If you can say you got a law passed that did this thing, even if you're sort of dangling the threat of a lawsuit over the heads of legislators, which is totally what happened, it's still more impressive to try and get that done legislatively. But the other thing, too, that's really important, some of this is just how you get to the lawsuit is important. So sometimes you just have to demonstrate that you couldn't get this done through the normal channels. The political system failed you, and so now the remedy has to come from the judiciary. So that was a part of the process, is for us to say, when we filed our initial briefs on this, it was to say, we really tried to do this. And in fact, we got kind of close. So there is that. So, but here's the other fun thing about this. I do live in downstate, and at the time, I sort of was living outside the community where I am. Decatur, just if none of you are familiar with Decatur, Decatur is sort of a post-industrial kind of town. If any of you know of it, you probably know of it because of like ADM, because that's where ADM has been headquartered. But very much an industrial kind of town, still very religious, as a lot of downstate is. But that's the kind of the community it is. It's a fairly diverse community in general, but there's lots of rural areas. You basically get 5 minutes outside of Decatur and you're in the country, and you get the typical kind of things that come about that. And so what basically has happened with the way that the districts are set around Decatur is that Decatur, kind of central, is fairly Democratic. You go out I was like 5 miles outside of Decatur at that time, and I was in a Republican district. And that's kind of how it works. You have everything around, you have blue in the center, red all surrounding. So when I started this process, I was actually corresponding with Republicans. And I always love talking about this to people, because people have this very precise idea of what they expect. Or at least I should say, people whose political views tend towards the left, at least, have this very specific way of what they expect is going to happen. Oh, the Republicans are probably just going to be like, we don't care about that thing. Or maybe say actively, I don't really want to do this for you because I might make my religious constituents upset, or something like that. And I will tell you that's not true at all. In fact, the interesting thing about this is that the responses I had from my politicians were actually really similar on both sides. And I say similar rather than better because the interesting thing about this that I always like to tell people is people expect that if something didn't get done, like when we weren't successful in getting legislation passed, people outside of Illinois were like, oh, well, the Republican legislature must not have let that through. And I just laugh. Like, you don't know anything about Illinois. Like, it was a Democratic legislature that did not let this law through. But one of the enemies of progress isn't necessarily opposition. It's apathy. People didn't care. People didn't think it was an important issue. So even people who would tell us, okay, sure, sounds fine. Well, it doesn't mean anything if they aren't going to actually push to do it. And that's really what this kind of came down to, is I had people who would tell me, yeah, sure, I think that's probably fair. That's a good idea. Or would tell me, yeah, that's probably not fighting a lawsuit over, so why don't we just go ahead and make it happen? But it didn't. And this is where I sometimes like to also point out one of my favorite Star Trek quotes, which is something that Captain Picard says, where he says, sometimes you can do, it is not failure if you do everything right. You can still do everything right and still lose. It's not a failure. And that's what happened. We did everything right, really. But it still didn't happen. It wasn't our fault. That's just sometimes how life is. So, again, both were receptive. I will say one thing, just to come back to the novice issue about this. I made one of the rookie mistakes in activism. When I talked to my state senator, everything went really well. I talked to an aide who was very receptive. She passed on the information to my state senator, and everything was kind of good. When I called my state representative after that, I expected a similar response. What I got was a very hostile person who, when I mentioned the Center for Inquiry, assumed that I was not a constituent. And I had not said from the very beginning, I am a constituent. Here's where I live. I am in your representative's district. And immediately, she blew me off entirely. And so I went, all right, let's play hardball. And I wrote a letter. And I will tell you, that letter got me a phone call pretty quickly, because I basically told my Republican representative, we will file a lawsuit over this. I understand you're a fiscal conservative. You probably want to save the state some money. So why don't you help us get this victory, get this resolved, and you can count this as a win in your category. That's an important thing, by the way, about lobbying, trying to tailor your message for your audience. And I knew that was going to be a thing that was going to be important to them. The fairness issue, they might not care about. But talking about what it's going to do to help the state, or at least help the state avoid a costly lawsuit when we're already dealing with a budget crisis, that's where I could use a little bit of leverage. And so I had phone calls, and they were both very, very receptive to that. And we actually thought that there might be a bill introduced that year. This is 2015. And because I even got a call from someone who said he was with the House Research Service. I later Googled his name and found out that he was the senior counsel for Jim Durkin, who's the House Minority Leader. So it got pretty high up from there. And ultimately, I kept calling, and they basically said, we're not going to worry about it. This was April. The calendar only runs till May. It wasn't going to happen. So we just basically started continuing to have conversations. A lot of this was not me. A lot of this was CFI talking to the Attorney General's office and things like that, trying to figure out what that was. And I will tell you also, from what I understand on their side, is they talked to lawyers, and the lawyers were all, yeah, why would we fight this? This isn't a good idea for us to fight. So really, in a lot of ways, I inherited a really favorable situation. I also want to say that because talking about how hard this was not as uphill as a lot of battles even are, and it was still pretty difficult. So we kept talking throughout that year, and here's where we got our brief ray of hope. So in 2016, we started talking about that. By the time I had moved, so I actually live in Decatur proper now, I have 2 Democratic lawmakers, and oddly enough, my representative never called me back. She sent me literally an email from her iPhone that said she'd look into it. I did get a call from my state senator, Andy Minar, who I'm a big fan of, and he was very receptive as well. He wanted to look into the issue, but he wanted to actually help with it too. And we actually did get what basically happened is that Senate President Cullerton was kind of like, okay, let's see if we can make this happen. And he used sort of a shell bill to introduce an amendment to that. I think actually, as it happens, that bill ended up being sponsored by our Attorney General-elect, Kwame Raoul. And that happened on May 18th, near the very end of the legislative cycle, which again was probably a thing that hurt us in timing-wise. And it passed, 51 to none. And that was also pretty impressive. If you notice that there are 8 no votes, that's because some people didn't understand. In fact, we had this really interesting conversation with somebody who apparently one of the senators thought it had something to do with same-sex marriage. And if you think about that, again, this is 2016. Same-sex marriage is a dead issue. We had it already passed by our legislature. It was a ridiculous kind of thing, but people didn't want it to be used as something for them in their next election. So whatever, they didn't vote. It was fine. It passed. But unfortunately, we didn't get it anywhere in the House. Nobody picked it up. And so if you don't have a bill that gets picked up in the House, doesn't have sponsors, doesn't get a vote, it's dead. And we knew this was going to happen when May 31st passed of 2016. And we're like, all right, you want to play hardball? We'll play hardball. And, I spoiled it. So we ended up filing that lawsuit, actually against Macon County's clerk, Stephen Bean. This is kind of funny that we were told, like, why did you do this in Macon County? And our response was, that's where I live. Like, where else are we supposed to do this jurisdiction-wise? And I had never, in fact, I have still never interacted with the county clerk. And by all accounts, he was not very happy about this because he's like, I don't even know this guy. Why is he suing me? And in fact, that was a large part in what they did, because I think he kind of got indignant. And even though the state's attorney was like, yeah, you're going to lose this case, just settle and get it over with really quick. Bean wanted to fight, basically. And this is part of where I find it very interesting. They did end up settle. It took them until December before we were having those conversations. But one of the arguments that they made, which was largely procedural, but here's the absurdity of this. And part of why this is just an absolutely strange kind of setup for this. In Illinois, if you were to perform a marriage, if you were to sign the marriage license as though you had the authorization to do that, and you didn't, that is a Class 4 felony. So if I had done that, and as I was telling people earlier, I did have one couple who, before all this happened, wanted me to do the wedding. I gave them my normal spiel at that time, which was, I can do the ceremony, I can't actually solemnize, and they said no, but then they ended up having somebody who could do the legal part, so it was fine. If I had gone ahead and signed that marriage license, that would have been a felony. I could have been punished with 1 to 3 years in jail for signing and returning a marriage license, merely because I did not fit into any of the classes the state said had the authority to do this. And so what Macon County came back with was, well, he didn't try to do this. He needed to actually give us a license, and for us to deny it, for that to be something that we could be sued for. Well, that's not legally how it works. But literally, they were saying I should have committed a felony in order to challenge this law. Fortunately, the district court found that to be a completely tendentious argument. And so at that point, even though they hired outside counsel, and to be honest, probably cost the county a lot more money than it really needed to be, they ended up settle. And so we had that conversation in late 2016. And then finally on January 4th of 2017, a date I could probably recite in my sleep by now, they handed a decision down in our favor, and we got everything we wanted out of that, which mainly was to say that statute was unconstitutional. And it gave us the right to solemnize marriages in the state of Illinois. And it was a big sigh of relief for me, because I finally knew that this was over and I could actually move on. I had been just trying to get to the work. That's all I had been trying to do. Like, I didn't get into this fight to have a fight. I got into the fight because I needed to get to where I am today. And even though I like talking about it, the work of being a celebrant is a lot more fun than all of this legislative and legal stuff. It's sort of a nice little feather in my cap, so to speak. But it's not what really drives me on this. I got into this because I really wanted to be able to provide this function for people. And so now we kind of get to where we're at. And I will say one thing real quickly on the response. The response I got was partially two things. I got the response of, wait, you had to do this? This happened in 2017 in Illinois, a blue state? And I'm like, yeah, that was definitely a thing we had to do. Some people who used some of the other, which again, functionally secular celebrants that they could see, like, oh, well, my friend got married by a secular celebrant, and I have to go, well, were they a humanist society? Because if so, it's a whole different thing. And trying to explain this to people has been very interesting, to say, like, well, there's a difference between secular but technically kind of attached to a religious organization and like totally secular, completely separate thing. And once people get that, then I think they tend to get that. And a lot of other people who tried to pull in other arguments, like I had somebody who tried to claim that I was trying to profit off this, like I was trying to make money, and I kind of laughed at that, thinking like, you can't even survive doing this full time. This is a thing that I do on top of all the other stuff I do. I have a day job where I work in IT. Like, this is not a way I could support myself, let alone become filthy rich off of it. And some people who just wanted to make other arguments about marriage, which is fine. People can make arguments about whether or not they like marriage, but if you want to have that fight, go do your own activism. Don't use my opportunity. This is an opportunity to just walk over mine. So what happened? Well, as I kind of mentioned, just do the work. And that's been the really nice thing. And again, there is a need for this. This is just to give you an idea of how this worked out for me. So in 2016, so this is pre-decision, I did one wedding. Couldn't solemnize, it was just the ceremony. It was fun. It was definitely like dipping my toe into the water, and I had a blast doing it. And it was one of those moments where I was like, this actually kind of works out for a lot of my different skills. It's like I've got skills for speaking and writing from being an English teacher. I've got this background in religion and rituals, so I kind of get what people are wanting from those things. I've got experience with these different facilitating roles in marriages and funerals. It was a good fit for me. So 2017 rolls around, and I can actually tell couples, I can do everything for you. I can't just do the ceremony and then you have to find somebody else to work around the legal side. I can do everything for you. And that number jumped to 11. Pretty good increase. And so far in 2018, now this is just projected, I've got a couple more to do this month, I'm going to hit 11 again, and I've done 2 funerals this year as well, where I got to then help with that part of those things. Again, it became a point where I could just stop worrying about all of these other things that were holding me back and just say, let's just do this. Let's do the things that people need. And functionally, I think here's where this kind of comes down to. Again, this is an important thing for me, in part, not just because it fulfills a role, but there's actually a part of this that is very strongly in me about having a more secular society. I would like people to rely on religion less where they can, because I think, and this is important to me in this context, because I get to say, you don't have to rely on religion to have this sense of meaning in your life. And I think communities like yours are another way of this is another option for you. It's not just meaning in religion or nothing. It's a way of saying there is something out there for you. You can have this without having to appeal to God or the supernatural or these other parts. You can find meaning. You can share meaning with others, even other religious people. You can share that meaning with others without having to do those things. And when people see that you can do it without those things, it lets them know that this is a live option. This is something that they can have. And that's actually a very useful thing for people to see. They don't have to be stuck with what they've known. They don't have to rely just on the old traditions. They can have that. And I've sometimes even argued for people, if you don't care about marriage, you don't ever intend on being married, you think the institution is old-fashioned or just something that we don't need to have, or if you don't find memorials to be interesting, I think that this is actually something that provides a social good. In the same way that if you don't have a child in public schools, you may still think that public education is a good thing because it provides a social good. And this is a social good that people have, to have this ability. And I'm really, really proud to have actually had a chance not only to make the law a little bit more equitable in this one way, but also to kind of be able to do the next step on that. So I will say one more thing, because we do the work, but there's still more work to be done. We've done it in Illinois, but there's a lot of other red, if you notice there. I will say a couple more things. So the fight has continued elsewhere since then. Since then, in 2017, we actually got a bill through the Oregon legislature. And in fact, I do have to give credit for that. This was actually the Secular Coalition for America, well, the Secular Coalition for Oregon, their chapter, who actually did this in this case. And I was really pleased to see that there were other groups that were kind of taking that up as well. And so Kate Brown signed a law that allows secular celebrants in Oregon. So we've got that taken care of. And as I've kind of mentioned before, in May of this year, actually my friends Jen Bean and Ed Brayton have filed lawsuit along with CFI. In fact, they happen to be represented by the same firm who represented us in the Illinois case, Schiff Hardin, who has an office not only here in Chicago but in Grand Rapids. And they've challenged that law as well. I have to tell you, I don't actually know where that stands because the county they filed that in was Kent County. Their county clerk actually ran for lieutenant governor with their attorney general, Bill Schuett, who they lost, if you hadn't heard that about this recent election. And he had actually been, the attorney general had been the one who had taken the case from them. And now they have a Democratic attorney general who I don't even know if she will care to fight that one. So that's very much up in the air. That one, again, is in the Sixth Circuit, so that could be an interesting one if they just settle that. And then just like in the past couple of weeks, I was thinking, man, this is great timing. I get to talk about this for the first time here. CFI also filed in Texas. So with CFI Austin, they actually filed that. And that's very new, so I have no developments on that. But this is a chance for us to try and branch out a little bit and find more places where we can take down these certain things and get the law just a little bit more equitable in terms of that. And we do also have some efforts in other states. I actually spoke in Ohio earlier this year. They had an attempt to do some lobbying for that. I don't have a whole lot of hope for that. They've got a pretty red legislature. And again, not that necessarily matters, but I don't think probably they're too busy trying to ban abortion and whatever they're trying to do in the state. And Minnesota, who knows? I think Minnesota's legislature actually flipped back to the Democratic, the DFL side. So who knows if that'll happen or if they'll have to do a similar thing. I think that might happen. So the nice thing is that I have friends involved in these fights, so I get to hear little things about it, but I don't think anything's official yet. So, and I think that kind of wraps up from there. So I think if we're ready for Q&A. You're not there? Oh, that's right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for your talk. I am the chair of the Celebrant Committee, and it was really interesting to hear your thing. And I did a wedding on Friday night, and I agree it's really a great way to spend your time. My question, I sort of have 2.5 questions, but that's against the rules. So I'm going to do one now, and if there's not a ton of other ones, we'll come back. The thing we've been thinking about and trying to figure out, and I don't know if you've seen any of this in your travels, is invocations at public meetings, and the idea that there's a prayer at the beginning of the town, the city council meeting or the whatever proceedings it is. And we've been trying to strategize about how to get on the roster for people who are allowed to do that. And I'm wondering if you've ever seen anybody talking about that issue, who controls that? Like, is there any advocacy around either getting rid of that practice altogether or making a broader list of folks who are included in playing the game?
Right. That is honestly a great question, and that gets a little bit tricky. I know that I have been involved with groups that have wanted to do this a little bit more, and I think there's kind of some grassroots people doing this a little bit here and there. Unfortunately, as much as I would like to see that become a thing that people just stick, the thing I like about secular ceremonies in general is that they can just be neutral. Like, people can come to me and just say, like, I just want a thing that works for my, like, I have a Catholic, like, one side's Catholic and the other side's Baptist, and I need them to work together, and I need something that's good for both of them. Like, just do that. Like, if you want an invocation, if you want some kind of thing to say, let's get something done here that works for the good of the community, that's great. And I think that's something that secular and humanist celebrants could be really good at. But the law kind of works against us in that case because of the Supreme Court case of Greece versus Galloway, where they basically have said, yeah, towns can do that if they want to. I don't know that that's an area I see a lot of activism in, mainly for that reason, because people know it was an uphill battle when we had Kennedy on the court. Now that we don't have that, it gets a little bit worse. So I don't know that that's the issue that gets pushed around. I think it's really good to try and put pressure on communities to say, you should voluntarily, even though there's no threat of a lawsuit, because you would lose the lawsuit at this point. I mean, just be realistic. That there is a good reason for them to say, include everybody in your community. If you're going to put religious people on the roster, find the people who do this. And if you are a humanist celebrant, you have some kind of title that works for you. You can say, I am certified by this organization. I am active in my community on X, Y, and Z, whatever you need to say. And that's a way you can actually come back to them and say, this is something you should try and do. And then when you do it, make sure that it's something that, again, works for everybody. And I think I've seen really good things out of the invocations I have heard in different places that they do. They stress commonalities. They talk about doing things for the greater good. They talk about, again, getting down to what people are there for, which is typically, at least it shouldn't be, it's not about God, it's not about religion, it's about the people you're serving. And so when you do that, it can be a positive thing. I think that would be an interesting thing to see more of. And again, more on the local level, because that's the kind of thing you could do at any point as best as you can.
Good morning. I have a question for clarification. When you sign off on the license for the couple that you have performed the ceremony, are you signing off as an individual, or do you also need to sign off as a member of CFI?
I do put on there that because typically they ask for a title of some kind. By the way, licenses are also very weird from county to county, and they vary a lot. So I have to kind of go through this every time I do a different county. But it is me signing on as an individual. I'm signing my name to that, and then when they ask for a title, I do actually more for legal reasons. Because if a county goes, wait, there's no title here, or this just says secular celebrant, if I have CFI secular celebrant, the county should all know about the decision that we had, and so they can say, all right, yeah, we have to do this. Again, most of the time, I think they don't really care. Just somebody signed off on it. That's all. If somebody did the work, that's all you have to do. As long as somebody got it within the 10 days, then that's good. But no, I'm not actually doing it on CFI's behalf, although I do report all of that information back to them, more or less just for documentation, just the paperwork, because since I am representing CFI in at least some small way, they want to make sure that I'm fulfilling the duties properly.
So thank you for joining us this morning. I am curious how, if you've received any pushback from organized religious groups about your efforts, because I would think that they would want to protect the right to do all these things, both because it's a source of revenue and it keeps people coming back, who may have strayed away from the church or the temple. It gets them to come back when they want to get married or they have a child.
That's a great question, and I love the pushback questions because it is very interesting. I think I've been lucky in some regards that I haven't received any pushback from religious groups, and I think that's partially because they don't know. I got to fly a little bit under the radar. Like when this came out, I was thinking like we were pushing this out to like media and stuff like that. I was worried that I told my boss, who didn't know I was doing this at the time. I told my boss at the place I was working, I was like, yeah, I was gone last Thursday because I was in federal court and we won the lawsuit and it might be in the media, so I thought I'd just let you know. But like nothing. Nobody really picked it up. I mean, other than atheist circles kind of like the secular movement kind of circles picked it up. I got to be on a few podcasts. So, but that's where I got most of the pushback was actually from the atheist community, but it was very, very limited. And the thing that we like to emphasize here is that it's just additive. It's just another right for that. It's hard for them to argue about you shouldn't have this right because we think it's our right only. That's just very bad optics. And I think to some degree that works in our favor. But I think for the most part, it's basically that nobody really knew. I could have maybe expected the bishop in Springfield, Thomas Paparocki. I could have maybe seen him being opposed to it because he's been very vocal on legal issues. He's one of the people who argued against the same-sex marriage legislation when that was coming up. He's about the only one I can think of in the area who would have probably done that. I don't think anybody else really cared that strongly about it. So I was fortunate in that regard. I didn't really hit any pushback from my local community or religious organizations.
Wait till you're doing 100 weddings a year, then they'll push back because they'll see the real competition.
Maybe.
So I have two questions, if that's okay. You were not ordained, but given this authority by CFI, but there are probably other organizations as well. And then how does the state determine whether or not you've been trained and certified by one of the organizations that they would agree is legitimate, if that makes sense? And then the second question is, what?
Start with one.
Oh, no, that's a good question. Again, for the most part, the state in general doesn't care a lot because this comes down to counties. And counties don't track this because Illinois doesn't. You don't have to register with any body. I think Nevada is one of the states, for instance, that you do have to actually register for that. And then there might be more of a process to actually do so. Illinois doesn't really do anything like that. So they kind of are going on the honor system that if you say you are, they're going to trust that. And again, with the idea that if you aren't, there's a criminal penalty for you if you aren't. So there's that threat from there. There's no threat to couples, by the way, as I was mentioning earlier. If a couple gets married and it turns out that the person who married them isn't authorized, the marriage is still valid. It's just the officiant that is going to be in hot water for it. But they don't really track any of that kind of stuff to check and see. And to be honest, most of the time, like if you go to the Universal Life Church and you go online and you do the thing, or the other one I like to point out to people is the Church of the Latter-day Dude. Or you could become a dudist priest. And I literally did this as a joke when in like 2007 or something like that because I thought it was funny. I have never seen The Big Lebowski, which is the whole basis for it. And that would have been more legal than my CFI certification before we had this lawsuit. So there's a little bit of absurdity, but there's nothing there. They don't require anything like that. You don't have to go through any process to prove, hey, here's my thing. Like they don't even ask for my certificate that shows that I have it. I could show it to anybody, but nobody asked for it. Nobody really cares. So just if you did this, then whatever, that's fine. So as long as you're willing to put your name to it and keeping in mind the legal penalties for it, then the state assumes that that's maybe enough to dissuade you from breaking the law, I guess.
Hey, Galen, thank you for your talk. Fellow celebrant and also practicer of dudism, very legitimate, I'll say. My question is more just like culturally. So all the weddings I've done, it's Chicagoland, and luckily it's been a lot of people where there's not a lot of pushback from the family, so having a secular celebration, not a big deal. It's more like they just didn't want to do it with a judge. They want something with a little more reverence. For serving in Macon County, which is surrounded by rural areas, is it a similar feeling over there, or is it more like there's people who are like they're the little pocket secularists in their community, and like that's them like reaffirming that? Like, I'm just wondering if the feeling is different culturally there, because I know that area is culturally different than just Chicagoland.
Right. It's kind of weird because I find that there are little pockets. Like I do a lot of weddings around Champaign. Champaign's a college town, so those are places where you do get those pockets of like when I ask people, I always ask people up front, like what are your backgrounds, like what are your beliefs, because I'd like to have an idea of where people are coming from. And from that area, people will say like, oh, I'm atheist or agnostic. I have had people who say like, I'm a believer, but I don't ever go to church. And I had one guy who said that they would feel like a hypocrite going back to the church just for this one thing. So like it's like, hey, God, I need you this one time, but not any of the rest of the time. And so I got that. Like that was fine. I've had I have one that I'm doing this coming year that they're Catholic, but one of them is remarrying, so they can't do it at the Catholic church. So they're just like, okay, let's just do a non-religious one, and that's fine. And I've had lots of ones like that. So it isn't always about their culture. Sometimes it's just their needs. And sometimes it's just we don't want to involve this one point. I think secular weddings can be great for interfaith couples, even when they're both religious. Certainly if one of them isn't religious. There's all kinds of other reasons. And again, it's just people don't want to bother with it. They don't want to bother. I also had one couple literally said, "Do you require premarital counseling?" And I said, "No, I don't require it, and I would not be qualified to give it." I have been married for 15 years, so I guess that's one qualification. But otherwise, I wouldn't feel qualified to do it. So that was fine. So it just kind of varies. I don't know that it's a culture thing so much as just where people are in their lives.
It's a wonderful talk. Thank you. I'm curious if you could just bring a little clarity about what Illinois law. Do we now have a new law, or is it just the legislators just accept what the courts say, and just bring a little clarity to that?
Yeah, I would love if the legislature would actually make the change that we asked for, which essentially would just be to allow some kind of again, secular celebrants, just doing that as some kind of organization that is, functionally like a religious organization would be, in having this role for officiants. But they haven't done it, and I don't think they probably will do it. There's lots of laws in this country that just aren't valid because they've been overruled by court decisions. I mean, how many sodomy laws or anti-miscegenation laws, I hate that word, or other things like that are there. I mean, there are states where their constitution bans people who don't believe in God from serving in public office. That's been illegal. That's been unconstitutional since Torqueso v. Watkins in 1969. Like, those things still exist on the books, and they won't go anywhere until it basically requires organizations to just go like, hey, this isn't a thing. It hasn't been a thing for a while. Why don't you just go ahead and make it not a stain on the Constitution or on statutes? I don't think it's probably going to happen for a while. We'll get stuck with the existing one until somebody decides they want to clean up. And there's lots of other bigger things to clean up in Illinois, just to be honest. So.
I'm still a little unclear why the Illinois suit was required after the district decision. So you said that the district decision still needed to, still required that there be a challenge in each of the states. So once you made the challenge, why didn't that then trigger the district decision that was already made?
I think it comes down to jurisdiction and just saying that states or counties, as it happens to be in this case for those, they have the right to take up those kinds of things. So it does have to actually, the decision is, I think the legal term is, the decision is controlling. So it applies, whereas the Seventh Circuit decision didn't apply in Ohio or Michigan because it's a different circuit. But so it still does have to be challenged, just because then the state gets a chance to defend it or choose not to defend it in court. And if they decide to defend it, then they can take it up differently. Whereas, if Indiana had just done a very bad job, which I think they kind of did, defending it at the Seventh Circuit, and Illinois thinks they could do better, that they could then take it to that point and challenge it, and maybe they could win. Maybe they could actually have better arguments, but they get a chance to do that. Or they get a chance to, in this case, just say, no, this isn't worth it, let's just settle. And I think technically you could have the same thing. If I came to, what if I came to Lake County, and Lake County decided they don't want to do it? Well, I could sue them, but then the whole thing would kind of start again. So it is kind of on a jurisdiction basis, although the decision is still going to have to be considered the whole way through. It's sort of a double-edged sword when it comes to that. You have to give them the chance to do that, or they can just say, no, just let the decision stand. And that's just how it works, for better or worse.
This is not a legal question.
Okay.
I'm curious about how you deal with memorials. If, for example, a family comes to you that you don't know, to do a secular memorial for a person who's died who you don't know, how do you handle that?
That is an excellent question. I'm really glad that we got around to memorials. Again, a lot of my focus here is marriage because there's a legal aspect to it. But I actually did get to do a couple of those, as I mentioned, this year. In those cases, one of them was from a family I knew, actually, who one of the mother of the deceased was actually a sort of a friend. And so in that case, I knew, but in another case, I didn't. And actually, the process is basically the same, where I just went and I spent time with the families, and I talked to them about what was important. I think the biggest thing about a memorial for me is that it's fundamentally a celebration of life. And that's another nice, when you're talking about commonalities, you can celebrate someone's life regardless of what views you have about what has happened since they've died. If you have a view in an afterlife, or if you have a view in reincarnation, or if you have a view in absolutely nothing that happens after, it doesn't matter what your view is, you can still celebrate their life. So I talked to them about the memories. I talked to them about what made them special. What was the meaning of their life? And that's really what we came down to. And I actually have had a really funny thing happen after the first one, because I had included, it was much more of an explicitly humanist bent, but I tried to not go so far where it was just where it was really glaring to people who would have been religious in that case. But I tried to make it so that it was true to what the deceased actually believed. That was kind of my big thing. Because I think there's a certain dignity in having your views respected even beyond the grave. And so when I did that after our graveside ceremony, a member of the family came and asked me if she could read she could see one of the passages again that I'd done. And she said, "I've never been to an atheist wedding before." And I just cracked up, because it's like, it wasn't, okay, sure. Fine, an atheist wedding. I guess that's fine. I don't call them atheist ceremonies. That's my view in particular, but I just try and make them that. But I think the biggest thing is just to focus on them and the meaning, and drawing that out. And if you can make it into a celebration of life, and the best compliment I ever heard out of that was, you did them justice. If I can do that, I think that's a successful memorial.
Hi, thank
Hello.
you very much for your program today. It was really interesting. You've teased us twice and piqued my curiosity. What was the atheist pushback that you got?
It was more or less people just thinking like this wasn't a thing we needed to do. It wasn't an important issue. It was just, again, people who were being cynical about the whole thing, more or less. Or people who said that this is unnecessary. Like I was just itching for a fight. Like if you, that's definitely a thing that you have to say if you don't know me very well. I am very non-confrontational as a person. If I'm doing it, it's because it actually matters. But it was still fairly minor. It was people who are just like, oh yeah, that's a thing that should exist. And I think people who value the secular life in general, even if they're people who don't want anything to do with community, they don't want anything to do with, they're sort of what I think sometimes is referred to as like the dictionary atheist. Like we just don't believe in anything, and we don't want anything else to do with anything that might smack of religion in any way, even if that's just meeting in a building. Those kind of people, you can't please them. And I don't worry about pleasing them, because they're the kind of people who don't care, and so they're not my clientele.
Back to atheist memorials. How do you put a price on that?
I'm not sure if that's asking me about my price or asking me like just the rhetorical question. Like, how do you put a price on that? I will tell you that in general, I find it really, really super hard to do that. In general, memorials are harder because, I mean, you can't choose the moment that someone dies. Like you could choose, like marriage you can plan for. You can't plan for a memorial. You just, I mean you can, but people don't. And so that's a little hard. And I probably tend to undercut my services a little bit for memorials. And I think that's in part because if somebody just paid me a salary to do what I do, and I didn't have to charge anybody, I would do that in a heartbeat. Absolutely, wouldn't be a question. I would go around and travel doing around this to charge people nothing, because I think it's so valuable. But I do tend to go on the lower side for that, where it's basically like, have I covered the amount of gas, the miles that I've done, the gas I've traveled, maybe a little bit of my time. Other than that, I will say that one of the parts of this is to remember that I am functionally a professional. Like, I'm not doing this full time, but what I'm doing is not just somebody who decided just do this on a whim. Like, I've put a lot of thought into this. I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of these in particular. And so I have to remember, like, okay, the work I'm doing is valuable. It is something that, that I deserve to at least get paid back to some degree for. But memorials, yeah. Honestly, I think when I did the one for a friend of the family, I told them I didn't really need to pay, and they paid me anyway, just because they didn't want to take advantage of me in that case. And that was fine. It is what it is. But that is hard. It is genuinely hard, because that's the one time in particular that I would not want even the appearance of taking advantage of somebody. I just want to give them what they asked for, make it meaningful for them, and then they have something that they can take away from that will be a happier memory.
Thank you, Galen. We don't have time for questions now.